happy to share the results of a randomized trial that we conducted and published quite recently, which is called EDNA-3. First of all, when you talk about Alzheimer's disease, you have to insist on the fact that with the modest benefits of drugs in Alzheimer's disease, psychosocial interventions are broadly, widely used to improve health outcomes of patients with Alzheimer's disease. They are really very popular. There is a large panel of therapies that are used in dementia, very, very large panel, including music therapy, art therapy, multisensorial with Snoezelen, for instance, techniques, light therapy, toy therapy, including, yes, some exotic therapies, short psychotherapy, and so on. The list is really very, very long, and it's a bit surprising to see such a long list, actually. So all these therapies are efficient in Alzheimer's. That's a question that, of course, we can ask. Obviously not, but they are used anyway. And this is the point. Sorry, what happened?
Of course, that's going to happen again.
Sorry. I was saying that was the point, so it's probably the reason why we had these. Although these non-drug interventions are very, very widely used, there are very scarce randomized control trials formally assessing the benefits of such interventions. And at least in France, maybe in Europe, I don't know what is, if it's also the case in Canada or in the United States, but in France, there are obviously two therapies which are very, very popular, which are cognitive training and what we call reminiscence therapy. Cognitive training, you all know what I'm talking about, consists in training patients and stimulating cognitive functions, memory, language, different types of memory, and so on. And reminiscence therapy, I will talk about it later on, but the rationale is that patients with Alzheimer's disease have a kind of preserved memory, which is what we call autobiographic memory. If you are familiar with these patients, you know that they are able to tell you a story when they were a child, playing at school with friends, sisters, family, and so on, and at the same time they are not able to tell you what they were doing yesterday. So this memory, this remote memory, is relatively preserved in Alzheimer's disease, and this kind of therapy will have the aim, will have targets this kind of memory by stimulating autobiographic memory. So these are the most popular, obviously, in Alzheimer's disease. Do we have evidence to that these therapies contribute to slow cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease? We have intuitions, of course. We can imagine that training cognition will contribute to slow cognitive decline in patients. That's what we hear very, very often. But do we have objective evidence that show this? Well, not really. I don't have time to make a systematic review of literature because it's a huge literature actually, but this is a review which has been published a few years ago, 3 years ago, and the conclusions of the review was the following. We don't have, the evidence regarding cognitive training are really limited, and actually we don't have sufficient research to demonstrate that such therapy contribute to slow cognitive decline. That was the main conclusion of this literature review. What about reminiscence therapy? Do we have evidence? Well, what tells us literature? There are 2 Cochrane reviews yielding inconsistent results, actually, so it's difficult to draw clear conclusions. And there is a very interesting trial because it's one of the very few randomized controlled trial conducted on a large panel of participants, nearly 500 participants, patients with Alzheimer's disease in the mild to moderate stage. The intervention consisted in applying reminiscence sessions during 10 months, and the authors had 3 efficacy measures: quality of life, medical social costs of disease, and caregivers' anxiety. And what were the results? Well, first result, no difference in quality of life between patients receiving the therapy and patients not receiving any psychosocial intervention. Second result, no difference regarding medical social costs of disease between patients receiving the therapy and control patients. And third result, which was significant, was about caregivers' anxiety, but unfortunately, it's not a mistake on my slide, unfortunately, they found increased anxiety in caregivers of patients receiving the therapy. So this trial is important because it probably tells us that we have too many intuitions, but we need proof now. We need evidence to better know what are the effects of such therapies in patients and caregivers. So that can be the conclusion of the literature review. Most of the data reported are gathered from studies with very poor methodology, or very often small sample sizes, 20 patients, 30 patients. But what does that mean? Nothing, really. Sometimes no control group, with a big selection bias. We don't know what participants accepted, refused, and we know that participants who accept to participate in this kind of study are not really the same, so we need to have information regarding this selection bias. No statistical treatment of missing data, dropouts, and we know it's a major bias in psychosocial intervention studies, and no long-term efficacy of measures, no long-term efficacy measures. That is, we always have a measure of efficacy just at the end of the intervention, but no measure 3 months, 6 months, 1 year later. Each of these biases contribute to overestimate positive effects, each of them. And if you accumulate them, then of course you have a tremendous overestimation of positive effects. I used to say to my students, you know that students to get their master degree have to do a research and they have to present their results to professors and so on. And I used to tell them, if you want to have positive results, significant results, it's really easy. Really easy. Do not control for those biases and you will get positive results. I am sure of that. So these are not details, methodological details. These are very important biases that lead systematically to overestimate effects of a therapy. And the other point is that most of the studies that are available involved group therapies. And very, very few, contrastingly, very, very few studies are available on individual, personalized approaches, except this one conducted by Maud Graf, but it's more or less the unique. So, before the study that I'm going to present, we didn't had really large-scale interventional studies involving long-term treatment. Several cognitive-oriented approaches included individual approaches with a randomized controlled methodology. So that's the reason why we conducted the national study that I will present right now. This study is called EDNA 3, for évaluation des thérapies non médicamenteuses en Alzheimer, 3 and 3 because 3 therapies were tested. It is a national study, a multicentric study involving 40 French memory clinics. And you have the map of France and the centers which participated. These memory clinics enrolled 653 outpatients with Alzheimer's disease, with classical criteria of Alzheimer's disease. There was a double randomization of the center, the site, clinical site, and of the patient. So the patient was randomized either in the usual care group, that is a group with no psychosocial intervention, in the group receiving cognitive training, the group receiving reminiscence therapy, or a group receiving individuals cognitive rehabilitation therapy. I will detail the program later on. They all have been followed up for 24 months. So that was one of the strengths of this study, is the possibility to apply these therapies for a long term and assess the impact in the long term. So 3 therapies were tested, as I was saying. First, cognitive training. What was cognitive training in our study? Well, this was a classical program of cognitive training consisting in a structured program of a set of tasks designed to involve various cognitive functions, memory, attention, language, executive functions, and so on. And all the tasks were tried to tap an activity of daily living to make it a bit ecologic. So, for instance, one session relied on managing domestic finances, and all the exercises, all the tasks were related to managing domestic finances. And we had 2 levels of difficulty according to patients' level of deterioration. The groups involved 5 to 8 patients, so it was small groups, and it was supervised by a trained psychologist who were trained specifically for this program. And the group sessions were held once a week during the first 3 months, and then every 6 weeks afterwards, so to cover the entire period of 24 months. Second program tested reminiscence therapy, which offers, as I said earlier, the opportunity to tap into the apparently preserved store of remote memories. The idea is to overstimulate this autobiographic memory of the patient in order to consolidate this memory and help them keep the self-identity. Each session focused on a different thing. For instance, one session was about school days or birthdays, so every patient had to share some memories about birthdays or about wedding or about working life and so on. So we had specific themes for each sessions. Caregivers were encouraged to contribute with materials, so they brought from home some pictures, records, and so on, and the sessions were prepared with the caregiver in order that the day of the session, patients could come with some available memories to share with the other participants. The groups also involved 5 to 8 patients, supervised by a trained psychologist also, of course, and the frequency of sessions was the same as that of cognitive training sessions. The third therapy tested was what we call individualized cognitive rehabilitation, that is a made-to-measure program. The psychologist had no idea about the program he was going to work to apply with the patient when he started therapy. That was the instructions that we gave to psychologists. Do not start with a specific idea of what you are going to do to work with the patient. take your time, and they had at least 2 sessions to define the goals of the program, of the rehabilitation program. And the program could aim at improving a particular meaningful activity of daily living or a leisure activity, anything that had some sense for the patient. So that's why we call it a made-to-measure program. At each session, the psychologist had to assess the relevance of pursuing the goal selected, and if he found that another goal was more significant and more relevant, then it could change at any time. So the psychologist had to be the most flexible as possible to personalize the program. And the frequency of the sessions, of course, was the same as that for cognitive training or reminiscence therapy. The primary outcome was the rate of patients alive and without moderately severe to severe dementia, as assessed by MMSE and the GDS scale, which are 2 scales very, very often used in dementia. So that was the primary outcome. And we also had several secondary outcomes, assessing cognition, functional abilities with 2 scales, behavioral disturbance with NPI scale, so scales that you probably know if you are familiar with this, with geriatrics, quality of life scale, apathy, depression, caregivers burden, resource utilization, and delay of entering nursing homes. Very briefly, the statistical analysis was the following. So we used regression models and survey models according to the outcomes. It was an intention to treat analysis, that is, all the patients randomized and included were considered as being part of the study until the end of the study, even though they drop out. And we applied also a statistical treatment of missing data. So we tried to control 2 major biases that I was talking about earlier. Here are the baseline characteristics of the participants, very, very rapidly. The participants were 79. We had 40% of men. Mean MMSE was 21.5, and about 90% were having anti-dementia drugs. First results, which are quite important actually, because that was one of my main fears when we started the study, is the rate of follow-up. It's elderly people with quite serious, severe disease, which is Alzheimer's disease, and the study was long, 2 years. So my fear was that we, at the end of the study, if we had 20% of patients still included in the study, it would have been very, very difficult to conclude anything. But actually it was not the case, and after 3 months we still had 90% of participants still involved in the study, and after 2 years we had 72% of participants still involved in the study. So that was the first result, very, very encouraging. Here are now the results for the primary outcome and the secondary outcomes. So first, let's see the primary outcomes. So I remind you that the primary efficacy measure was the rate of patients alive and who did not reach the severe stage of dementia. Here is, in this first column, the usual care group, so the group with no particular psychosocial intervention. Here is the column of patients having received cognitive training, patients having received reminiscence therapy, and patients with individual personalized program. So first line, displaying the primary outcome. Actually, we had 88% of people in the usual care and the control group that after 2 years of follow-up were alive and did not reach the severe stage of dementia. 47% in the cognitive group, 45% in the reminiscence therapy group, and a bit more, 54% in the individuals program. Actually, there was no statistical difference, even though a slight tendency in the last group, but no major difference, and no statistical difference between the groups. What about now the other secondary measures? If we look at cognitive training group and reminiscence therapy group, well, I'll let you look at this table. Actually, no difference at all between control group and the two other groups. No difference regarding cognition, no difference regarding functional abilities, disability, no difference regarding behavioral disturbance, no difference in depression, quality of life, caregivers burden, and so on. So 2 years after applying cognitive training, reminiscence therapy, nothing has changed and nothing has improved compared to the control group. That was an important result, of course. And let's see the last group, which is the individuals program. Then it's very, very interesting because we have some significant results. And actually, we have significant results regarding disability. And that was the AGIR scale, is a scale of disability, pretty the same in the other scale of disability, which is the DART scale, and marginal effects regarding behavioral disturbance, the level of burden of caregivers, and the score in the root light scale, which is a scale of utilization of social medical resources. So the most important, less degree of disability in the patients having received this therapy, the individuals program. And the other important results is regarding the delay of entering nursing home. Actually, if you look at the, I don't know if it's brown or gray, but if you look at this curve, which is a curve modeling the probability of being alive and living at home, you see that at any time of follow-up, actually, this group has the better rate of living at home. And at the end of the study, there is a significant, there is a significant delay of 6 months. That is, the group having received the individuals program, the individuals cognitive rehabilitation program, entered nursing homes 6 months later compared to the control group and the other groups. So, to conclude, this trial is the first large-scale interventional study involving long-term treatment, a large sample, several cognitive-oriented approaches, and a randomized clinical trial methodology. So that's why these 44 memory clinics participated to the study, which was quite difficult to conduct. The 3 non-drug therapies tested had no impact on the primary efficacy measure, which was the probability of being alive without reaching the severe stage of disease. And the second result is that for the 2 group therapies, that is cognitive training and reminiscence therapy, none of the secondary efficacy outcomes differed significantly from the control group. So I don't know if you are surprised or not, but it was a major result. The other result, the positive result, and I will of course end with this one, is that the message is not that we cannot do anything against this terrible disease. The greater clinical effects we observed was with the therapy consisting in applying a made-to-measure program in an individual modality. And actually we found, as I showed you in the table, that after 2 years of follow-up, these patients had a better functional abilities, less disability than patients with the other therapies or no therapies. And second important result, we achieved to delay the institutionalization of 6 months, which is not completely nothing. And we also had marginal effects on behavioral disturbance, caregivers burden, and social medical costs. So that's a proposal, but that was the conclusion of the paper. Individuals' cognitive rehabilitation therapy should be seen as an adjunctive treatment of Alzheimer's disease and should be preferred to group therapies, unless we have other results showing the opposite. And that's all. That's just to present my group in Bordeaux. It's quite a large group because we are conducted very large studies, not only interventional studies, but also epidemiologic studies. And these kind of studies need a lot of people and work, so here they are. Thank you very much.